Um, Very good morning to all of you joined this Sunday morning. First of all, I'd like to thank AIOC organizing committee for giving us the opportunity. Today, we'll be discussing our IC on facial nerve palsy in ophthalmologic perspective. A normal facial function plays a critical role in person's physical, psychological, and emotional status. And the disfiguration caused by facial nerve palsy can have a devastating effect on visual and psychological health of a person. And an ophthalmologist plays a pivotal role in managing facial nerve palsy right from the diagnosis to rehabilitation. Ophthalmologists managing facial nerve palsy should be aware of a wide range of choices of medical and surgical armamentarium to treat facial palsy. In this IC, we will be describing the varying dimension of facial nerve and facial nerve palsy so that the treatment of such patient can be individualized to give the best outcome. To start with, I will start with the introduction of my co-instructor. I'm Dr. Joyita Das. I'm a consultant orbit oculoplasty surgeon practicing in Desai Hospital. I'll be talking on evaluation and grading system of facial palsy and non-surgical management of facial palsy. Our next instructor is Dr. Nidhi Pandey. She is a consultant orbit oculoplasty surgeon practicing in Indira Gandhi Eye Hospital and Research Center, Lucknow. She will be discussing on facial nerve, the journey from anatomy to physiology. Next is we have Dr. Shruti Tara with us. She is a senior consultant orbit oculoplasty surgeon practicing in Sankara Eye Hospital, Coimbatore. She has a vast experience on managing such cases, and she will be talking us with Bell's palsy, the controversies, and the current treatment protocol. And finally, Dr. Saptakiri Bhatla, sir, he is a senior consultant and head of the Department of Orbit and Oculoplasty, Sankara Eye Hospital, Bangalore, and he is also the dean of Sankara Vision Academy. And sir will be talking on a surgical management of facial nerve palsy. So over to you, Dr. Nidhi.
Hi, Raita.
Yes.
My screen.
Yes.
Jaita, if you stop sharing.
Yes, I'm trying. Is it stop now? Is it okay now?
Yeah, I guess.
Okay, please share your screen.
So very good morning, everyone.
It's not ready.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible and visible.
So a very good morning. I'll be talking about facial nerve anatomy and its clinical application. So it's derived from the second brachial arc. So the muscles of the face, the occipital frontalis, the platysma, stylohyoid, posterior velloidic gastrix, stapedius, and auricular muscles, which are derived from the second brachial arc, are supplied by the facial nerve. So all congenital oral dysplasia should be evaluated for the presence, morphology, and the course of facial nerve. Now, broadly, we can divide it into the supranuclear portion, a nuclear portion, and the infranuclear portion. So, the upper motor neuron are located in the facial motor area in the precentral gyrus hair. The corticobulbar tract descends with the axons, crosses to the opposite side, and synapses with the lower motor neuron located in the pons. Now, the nerve is anteriorly related to the sixth nerve nucleus and posteriorly related to the sixth nerve nucleus and anteriorly related to the vestibulocochlear nerve. This exits the brainstem and enters the facial canal in the temporal bone, and finally exits the cranial cavity through the stylomastoid foramen to end into its terminal branches. Now, when it is exiting from the brainstem, it has its motor root and its sensory root, which when they enter into the internal auditory meatus, they join as a single nerve. In the facial canal, the narrowest portion is the labyrinthine segment that is most prone to compression in various lesions. Coming to assessing the level of the lesions depending upon the clinical features. Now, the lower motor neuron has a dorsal portion and lateral and ventral portion. The dorsal portion has got bilateral supply, while the lateral portion has just unilateral supply. So the upper motor neuron spares the upper portion of the face, while the lower motor neuron affects the entire side of ipsilateral side of the face. So the common areas affected in upper motor neuron palsies is the cerebral cortex, the internal capsule, and the cerebral peduncle. Hence, any patient who is presenting of forehead needs a neurological evaluation and referral to a neurosurgeon most probably. Coming to the nuclear area, where if the ventral pons is involved, the facial paralysis would be accompanied by affection of the sixth nerve and a contralateral hemorrhage affection of the corticospinal tract. While if the tegmentum is involved, the facial paralysis would be accompanied and the contralateral hemiplegia would be accompanied by the paralysis of the conjugate gaze to the side of the lesion due to affection of the PPR. Another common area where the nerve is exiting from the brainstem is the cerebellopontine angle lesions like the caustic neuroma. These could be accompanied by all the gamut of features of facial nerve paralysis, along with the eighth nerve involvement presenting as deafness, vertigo, or tinnitus, and or the fifth nerve involvement presenting as ipsilateral sensory loss, which is tested by corneal reflex. So in any such patient, we have to test the lacrimation and the corneal reflex. Now, when it comes to the infranuclear portion, the sensory, motor, or the parasympathetic functions may be involved to various degrees depending on the level of the lesion. So if the part between the internal acoustic meatus and the geniculate ganglion is involved, all the sensory, motor, and parasympathetic portions, the functions will be affected, leading to not just facial paralysis, but affection of salivation and lacrimation. There will be hyperacusis and loss of taste sensation from the anterior two-thirds of the ipsilateral part of the tongue. However, once the greater petrosal nerve is already exited, the lacrimation will be spared and we can test it with Schirmer's. Now, when the nerve to stapedius has already escaped, the hyperacusis won't be there, so there will be a facial paralysis along with affection of the salivation and loss of taste sensation. Now, the terminal branch would only produce the motor symptoms, that is the affection of the facial magnetic muscles. Coming to radiology, if we are suspecting a lesion at the cisternal, canalicular, and labyrinthine segments, it's important to mention that the images have to be focused at the internal auditory canals, and a high resolution T2 weighted and contrast enhanced T1 weighted images should be ordered. A temporal bone lesion like a fracture or a temporal or an affection of the internal ear requires an MRI of the geniculate ganglion along with the temporal bone CT to cover the tympanic and mastoid segment and the stylomastoid foramen. The extracranial segment needs evaluation of the parotid gland area. A common clinical entity we come across is the hemifacial spasm, where the nerve, when it is exiting through the brainstem, is commonly affected by a loop of the posterior inferior cerebral artery or the inferior anterior cerebral artery or the vertebral artery, a combination of these and very rarely a vein. Coming to two important areas, one is the temporal area where the branches of the temporal nerve lie deep to the superficial temporal fascia. So while performing a brow lift or a facelift, we have to be careful of this area. Similarly, in the lower face, when the branches are running deep to the superficial musculopancreatic system, they become superficial just medial to the masseter muscle, where we have to be careful. The synkinetic syndromes like Fraze syndrome, where the parasympathetic branches start innervating the sweat glands and the cutaneous tissue, and hence there is sweating and flushing during mastication. Similarly, in crocodile tears, which usually follows Bell's palsy, the salivatory nerves start synkinetic or they are misdirected to the lacrimal gland, and hence during mastication there is lacrimation. So to conclude, applying the anatomy with the clinical history and examination help us identify the probable cause of facial nerve palsy and hence directs our management appropriately. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Nidhi, for this nice crisp and compact presentation. So if there is any question, we'll be dealing in the panel discussion. Thank you. So in the next presentation will be mine. I'll be talking on.
Oh, is it? Sorry.
Oh, sorry, madam.
Sorry. Am I
okay,
supposed to come after this?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, right. I'll stop sharing.
Yes, ma'am. Please do. Yeah. Now I'll be discussing on facial palsy, the evaluation and the grading system. I have no financial interest, and I have taken proper consent from the patient and the parents for using the photographs. So we have already learned from Dr. Nidhi that the facial nerve has 3 roots: the motor root, visceral, and another is visceral efferent fiber that expresses the facial expression of facial muscle, and a special sensory fiber that supplies taste to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. The motor root that expresses the facial muscle divided into 5 branches, which supplies the muscle of facial expression in this manner. The etiology of facial nerve can be grossly divided into idiopathic, or it is also known as Bell's palsy. This is the most common cause of facial palsy. It may be congenital, it may be infectious, both bacterial and viral. It may be systemic or neurogenic, and traumatic. Lastly, it is neoplastic. The idiopathic facial palsy or Bell's palsy, this is the most common cause of facial palsy. It is previously known as it is idiopathic, but currently it is known as it is actually caused by HSV type 1 virus. The onset is sudden and the disease usually evolves within 72 hours. The prognosis is good with complete recovery in 70%. Corticosteroids are the mainstay of therapy. Next is congenital facial palsy. It may be caused by birth trauma. This is the first case. You can see this lady has a birth trauma during forceps delivery, and she had this facial palsy in the right side. And other causes are dysgenesis and the syndromes like Mobius syndrome, Michelson-Rosenthal syndrome, and hemifacial microsomia. The man in the down in the you can see there is hemifacial microsomia, also microtia. He has a small ear. Next group is infection. The Ramsay-Hunt syndrome or herpes zoster ophthalmicus is an important cause of facial palsy, cause of infective origin. Lyme's disease, it's a spirochetal disease. HIV, tuberculosis, and Hansen's disease, especially in a third world country like in developing country like India, it is an important cause of facial palsy. Otitis media, mastoiditis, cholesteatoma is also a reason. And in this COVID pandemic, there is also raised in the facial palsy cases, and it has been published all over the globe. The patients are presenting with facial palsy even, and all those cases are so not all, just more than 1/4 of the cases, that is 25% of the cases, are presenting with high level of SARS-CoV virus, immunoglobulin IgG and IgM. So COVID have to be a differential diagnosis in this pandemic at least. Let's come to Ramsay-Hunt syndrome. This is a very painful condition. It is characterized by triad of facial lower motor neuron facial palsy, the otitis externa, and vesicle in the half of the face. This is a very painful condition, and the weakness is severe. And more involvement of the other nerve like trigeminal nerve also can be associated with this. The treatment is acyclovir. With the starting of acyclovir, there is dramatic relief of pain. Next is facial palsy in Hansen's disease. This is very peculiar pattern. The lepromatous leprosy, it is usually present as a bilateral, and the tubercular leprosy cases, the cases present with an unilateral manner. It mimics upper motor neuron palsy because of the patchy involvement which spares the forehead. In these cases, you can see the patient has this ridges in both the side, which mimics that is a unilateral, but it is actually not unilateral. This is lower motor neuron involvement with some patchy involvement of the nerve. Next is traumatic, vascular, and neoplastic. On neoplastic, there is CP angle tumor and infiltration of the skin cancer, that is squamous cell carcinoma with pedineural spread. This is a case of a facial palsy. She has developed this right-sided facial palsy after her CP angle tumor excision. And the next case is a squamous cell carcinoma survivor. She had a infiltration of oral cancer and squamous cell carcinoma with a pedineural spread in the left side. Next group is systemic and neurologic cause. Here we have autoimmune disease, diabetes mellitus, sarcoidosis, Guillain-Barré syndrome, multiple sclerosis, and these all are usually bilateral facial palsy, and they are chronic causes of facial palsy. They don't present in an acute way. Now come to the examination portion. First, observe the patient at rest. If you see the patient carefully, you will be able to find out the facial asymmetry, palpebral fissure. There is widening of the palpebral fissure on the affected side. The nasolabial furrow will be shallow, and there will be voluntary or involuntary movement. And in case of zoster and old scar of surgery, we have to look for rashes of herpes zoster and any old scar of surgery to find out the cause. This will lead us to a diagnosis. Upper motor versus lower motor neuron. This can be just diagnosed by a simple test. You just have to ask the patient to look up, and if the forehead furrow is in both sides, that means that it is a upper motor neuron type, because the forehead is supplied by the both side, the supply from the both the side, and the lower motor neuron, there will be absence of forehead furrow. Next ocular examination. We have to check for the base corrected visual acuity, any ectropion is present or not. Then we'll have to ask the patient to close the eye to look for lag ophthalmos and to measure the strength of orbicularis oculi. Then ask the patient to smile and ask the patient to puff. This will also help us to measure the power of the orbicularis oris and other visual mastication muscle. Next, the parotid gland, lacrimal gland, and other head and neck gland has to be palpated. There are some other ocular examination that should not be missed, like have to look for Bell's phenomenon. In Bell's phenomenon, when the patient is closing the eye, there will be upward rotation of the globe. And this is very important, because if the patient has poor Bell's phenomenon, they are more risk for corneal exposure. Have to ask, then the corneal reflex has to be tested, and the Sarmer's test, because some of the patient has associated trigeminal nerve palsy also that supplies the cornea. And we have to look for other cranial nerve involvement. If there is pain, paresis of limb, paresthesia of the face and limb, and the progression of the facial palsy is gradual, along with involvement of other cranial nerve, and the paralysis is persistent beyond the 6 months, and there are some history of regional skin cancer, this is probably not Bell's palsy, and these cases must be referred for further investigation, especially neurological examination. So the indication for MRI in facial palsy cases are upper motor neuron palsy, recurrent facial palsy, involvement of other cranial nerve, no sign of recovery after 6 weeks of treatment, very early recovery, that is embolism or tumor compression. Very early recovery is also a dangerous thing. And if the patient has facial palsy under 18 years of age, these cases should be sent for at least an MRI of the brain. There are some conditions that masquerades facial palsy, like hemifacial spasm and lag ophthalmos due to pathology other than facial palsy. This is the case with the hemifacial spasm on the left side, and this patient mimics or actually referred to me with a diagnosis of facial palsy. Another is scleroderma. In scleroderma, there is tissue shrinkage, and that causes the impression of lag ophthalmos. That also looks like a facial palsy. Next is myopathy. Myopathy patient also present with a lag of thalmus that may masquerade as a facial palsy. And this is though very rare, and I am very lucky to, not very lucky, I mean maybe unfortunate to get this patient of a, this is just a 16-year-old lady with this progeroid syndrome, and because of the tissue shortening, she had presented with lag of thalmus. And in the down cases, I have performed an scleral grafting to vertical, to increase the vertical height of the lower lid, and this is just immediate post-op. So any nerve palsy should have been graded, and there are also grading system used in facial palsy for better monitoring and treatment and monitoring of the patient. There are many grading system which are available over the years, that are Sydney system, Sunnybrook system, and Hauser-Brackman system. These are all almost devised by or otolaryngologists, that is ENT surgeon and neurologists, but none of this system actually says more about the ocular health. So here comes CADS grading system that is now currently in use. It is devised by Dr. Raman Malhotra et al. From NHS, and he has devised this grading scale, which mentions the 4 dimensions of ophthalmic involvement, that is cornea, static asymmetry, and dynamic function of the lid and the face, and synkinesis. And in this grading, he has very nicely graded the condition of the cornea and condition of the cornea, and he also has seen the what is the in the follow-up cases, we can see the patient is deteriorating or not. And this grading system is very helpful for ophthalmologists for monitoring such cases. So to summarize, the ophthalmologist plays a pivotal role in the evaluation and rehabilitation of the patient with facial palsy. It is crucial to recognize and treat the potentially life-threatening underlying causes that causing the facial palsy. Proper evaluation and grading of facial nerve function is important to formulate the management protocol. Thank you. Next, I would like to ask Dr. Shruti Tara Madam to give her talk.
Am I visible? Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. You are very much visible and audible. Please.
Right. I thank Joyita for having me included in this IC. Must say this is a rather interesting one. And in the next couple of minutes, I will just go through the Bell's palsy controversies and current treatment protocol. As we all know, Bell's palsy is an idiopathic acute unilateral facial nerve weakness. Ocular pathogenesis is rather obscure, and so stems the controversies as well. So we all know that it is because of the injury to the nerve, edema to the nerve, and sometimes stress or adenovirus infection induces activation of the latent virus. It was also found that when herpes virus was injected into the stylomastoid foramen in the animal model, it caused facial paralysis in some of them. And facial nerve biopsy, when they did, the intraneural inflammation was very consistent with that of a viral infection. Culture positive for herpes simplex virus from the nasopharynx was also obtained in some of them. But it was found on the epineural biopsy when they did the decompression. In contrary, only very few patients with Bell's palsy have demonstrated antiviral antibodies in the cerebrospinal fluid. Now, the viruses have also never been identified in the nerve tissue by electron microscopy, and seroconversion did not happen in these patients. But when the virus was injected into the stylomastoid foramen in some of the guinea pigs, they did develop some seroconversion, but they did not develop Bell's palsy. That was rather interesting and contrary to whatever was told earlier. And so when a patient comes with Bell's palsy, we are always confused whether we need to send them on a routine blood investigations. Do we need to image these patients? If at all, what should be the imaging? Do we have to CT scan them or MRI? While treating them, is it the steroids alone or antivirals alone, or do we have to give a combination therapy? Do we have to send them for nerve studies like electroneurogram and electromyography as a prognostic factor? Do we have to send them for physiotherapy? Do we need to decompress them? If we have to refer them, when and who? And when do we intervene them surgically? These are the things that run in our mind when we see a patient with Bell's palsy. So for this, the American Academy of Otolaryngologists and the head and neck surgeons, they came up with a clinical practice guidelines with 11 controversies and respective protocol for that. Now, why do we need a guidance? One is basically to improve the accuracy of the diagnosis, to improve the quality care and the outcome, and to decrease the harmful variation in evaluation of management of Bell's palsy. Now, they strongly recommended that every patient should undergo a detailed history and a physical examination to exclude the identifiable causes. Like just now, Dr. Joyita has told what were those. And we need to take do a strong physical examination. A routine laboratory testing is advised against. Why? Because there is a low detection rate of this herpes simplex virus, even with the use of PCR, ELISA, Western blot, or the cerebrospinal fluid tapping. But the laboratory testing may be indicated in selected patients. Now, this we found a little interesting. We saw this patient a week back rather. So he came with left-sided Bell's palsy. We gave a vague history of fever in this current era of COVID. So we just asked for a COVID-19 IgG antibody. Mind you, he was not tested RT-PCR positive. With that, he came up with an IgG antibody was strongly positive. So we should be selective in whom we send for the investigations. Routine diagnostic imaging is not recommended because the enhancement along the involved facial nerve around the area of geniculate ganglion is commonly seen, and it does not influence the course of therapy. So if so, when do we image? If there is a history of trauma to the temporal bone, if there is any history of tumor, paralysis that fails to recover in the expected time frame, if there is a development of new symptoms, second paralysis or other cranial nerves. Like again, this gentleman, after a couple of days, he developed defective vision. So, but when we imaged him, we did not find any abnormal enhancement seen along the facial nerve canal, but the perioptic CSF space was prominent. So, what should be the imaging modality, MRI or CT? It's invariably MRI, which the imaging of the entire course of the facial nerve with and without contrast, and to include the internal auditory canal in it. Now, when it comes to treatment, they recommended that strongly for oral steroids prescribed within 72 hours of the onset of symptoms in patients older than 16 years. Why? Because we know that Bell's palsy is because of inflammation and edema, and oral corticosteroids is a potent anti-inflammatory agent. Sullivan and et al. In their trial of 551 patients, they gave patients with Bell's palsy oral steroids and showed a significant improvement and reduced synkinesis as well. So after evaluating them for 9 months post-treatment, they found that 94.4% recovered with prednisolone and 81.6% with placebo group. So they recommended a 10-day course of oral steroids on tapering dose. Antiviral monotherapy was not recommended, is because in the a study published in the Lancet Neurology in 2008, when they compared 207 patients, did not show any improved recovery rate as against 29 who were treated with placebo. But a combination therapy with antiviral was given as an option based on the randomized control trial by Sullivan FM. What they did was, what they said was the antiviral combined with oral steroid was not statistically significantly superior to oral steroid alone, but it can be given as an option. Why? Because 83% of them showed improvement, complete recovery 3 months after prednisolone and placebo, whereas 79.7% with prednisolone and acyclovir. It was not statistically significant, so they said it can be an option. But they strongly recommended eye care examination and eye care as such. But surprisingly, there was no trial as such for this. They recommended routine drops and ointment in the night, taping of the lids in the night, and a chemical tarsorrhaphy, like in this patient where we have given botulinum toxin to the levator and creating a temporary chemical tarsorrhaphy. Electrodiagnostic testing in incomplete paralysis was strongly not recommended, because if a patient has clinically some amount of voluntary contraction, they are very highly likely to recover. Electrodiagnostic testing in such patients provides no further insight. But if the paralysis is complete, they gave that as an option, because if this has to be done approximately 72 hours later, because if we do anything earlier than that, the nerve would not have gone a complete Wallerian degeneration, and some physiologically viable tissues can give us a wrong reading. So electroneurography is a surface electrode recording system, and facial electromyography is performed by inserting a needle electrode into the affected muscle. So this is how they interpret it, and this is the electrode is placed in front of the ear, and we have two electrodes on either side of the nose, and the amplitude is recorded. So percentage of degeneration is recorded by 100 minus the amplitude of the involved side by the amplitude of the uninvolved side multiplied by 100. More rapid the degeneration, more severe is the injury, and patients who do not reach 90% of degeneration by 3 weeks have got very good prognosis. So this is a prognostic indicator in patients with complete Bell's palsy. Surgical decompression on a routine basis is not recommended, but there is some controversy which stems from good outcome in some patients with incomplete paralysis, but lacks a large trial. Since there are most of the patients are not surgical candidates due to excellent overall recovery, it is not really recommended on a routine basis. Physical therapy is not recommended because there is no accepted or a consistent physical therapy available till date. Patient follow-up is highly recommended with new or worsening of the symptoms. If there is any new ocular symptoms or incomplete facial recovery within 3 months, like that same gentleman who developed loss of vision after 3 days had optic neuritis and now currently under neurology care. When the patient fails to recover completely within 3 months, warrants re-evaluation to reconsider the initial diagnosis and also to plan the reconstructive options, if any, and appropriate referral. In the interest of time, I'll skip this. It is the same thing which I've put in the tabular column. But there has also been recent guidelines in the management by the Korean journal, by the medical sciences, but it has not been validated as yet. They have recommended that it be shifted to Sunnybrook and EFACE system of grading system. And neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio is the severity inflammation, which is a marker. And they say that lower NLR was observed in patients with more favorable outcomes. Nimodipine is a calcium channel blocker, which is also neuroprotective and promotes axonal sprouting. So this can be used in, but there is lacking of evidence based on this. And also the mycophenolate mofetil, which is an immunosuppressive agent, was found to be effective in some animal models and can be considered in traumatic facial palsy, but there's no human trials available as yet. And muscle transfer, they have recommended in for facial reanimation, apart from the other surgery. So thank you so much. And if you're interested in going through the history of facial palsy, you can go through the Wikipedia. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this insightful talk. It is very, we have learned a lot of new things in this presentation. Next, I'll be presenting just a minute, on medical management or non-surgical management of facial palsy. Good morning once again. Here I'll be talking on non-surgical or medical management of facial palsy. These are the effects of facial palsy on eye. There is lagophthalmos, incomplete blink, lid retraction, paralytic ectropion, and in the late stage, there is synkinesis, that is crocodile tear, Manin-Amat, and auriculotemporal syndrome of gustatory sweating. The ocular surface is damaged, severely damaged in facial palsy. The mechanism is orbicularis oculi function is reduced, that causes poor blink reflex, inadequate distribution of tear, this causes tear dysfunction. There is reduced tear production and poor corneal sensation. where there is associated trigeminal nerve dysfunction. And in poor Bell's phenomenon, there is the surface is again at more risk of damage. There is exposure keratopathy, non-healing epithelial defect, corneal ulcer, opacity, conjunctival injection, and dry eye. So the ophthalmic management of facial nerve palsy is divided into acute stage management and chronic stage management. The acute stage management is usually the conservative management by medical and some other device, medical management and other devices. And the chronic stage management, it is mainly based on surgical treatment, chemo denervation by botulinum toxin injection, and rehabilitation. Here I will be talking on acute stage management. The aim of acute stage management by the ophthalmologist is to protect the ocular surface from exposure and to improve the patient comfort and vision. The treatment option depends on predicted prognosis of return of nerve function. That is, if we are suspecting that patient has some permanent damage to the nerve. That is, in case of neurosurgery of acoustic neuroma, there is transection of the nerve. There is no chances of recovery. In these cases, we have to treat more aggressively and quick. And where we are suspecting that it may be a Bell's palsy or there may be recovery within few weeks, we will be little conservative in this management. The degree of risk to the cornea again depends on amount of lagophthalmos, quality of Bell's phenomenon, and presence of lower lid ectropion. The tear substitute at the initial conservative management aims to protect and lubricate the cornea. It is recommended in patients with low risk of corneal changes. Tear substitute stabilizes and thickens the precorneal tear film, keeps the ocular surface wet and lubricated. It also helps to repair the ocular surface damage and keeps the ocular surface smooth. Tear surface again can be an artificial tear, which can be given 4 times a day if it has preservative, and if it is preservative free, it can also be given in hourly doses, because preservative, if it is preservative is there, it will ultimately cause epithelial defect damage. And another preparation is artificial tear gel, especially petroleum jelly based ointment, and that is usually advised given in bedtime. And if there is significant lagophthalmos, we will advise artificial tear gel. The tear substitute again ranging from cellulose derivative like HPMC and CMC to polyvinyl chloride, sodium hyaluronate, povidone, hypermelose, and PEG, and each and every have some advantage and disadvantage. We have a wide array of choices of tear substitute in exposure keratopathy use. There are some devices, that is a moisture chamber goggles and a protective ocular bubble. These are also in use for, they also successfully helps to prevent the exposure keratopathy. But the problem is patients usually do not tolerate these heavy moisture goggles. But this protective ocular bubble is very useful, but it is, to the best of my knowledge, it is not readily available in our country. So we usually use this indigenous moisture bubble using cellophane, simple cellophane paper and medical tape. Next is eyelid taping. A lot of practitioners still uses this eyelid taping and patching during sleep in facial palsy lagophthalmos patient, but currently it is absolutely not recommended, because this patient has poor orbicularis oculi tone. So when they are sleeping, there is unopposed action of LPS and opening of the eye, that causing risk of corneal abrasion by the patch itself. So it is absolutely not recommended now. Scleral contact lenses are the another option for protecting the cornea. They actually act like a liquid bandage over the cornea and protects the corneal health. Where there is a patient where the satisfactorily not managed by the lubricant alone, we can use punctal occlusion, silicone punctal plug, which is a reversible one. It is it's commonly used. This is very simple technique, and if it is not available, then simple punctal cautery can be given. Next is temporary ptosis by botulinum toxin or Botox injection. It is given transcutaneously. 7.5 to 10 unit is given in the anterior orbital loop, just behind the superior orbital rim in the mid-pupillary plane. The adverse effect is superior rectus palsy, but if it is given properly, it stays for a few weeks, and it helps to help the cornea. This botulinum toxin also used in other conditions, sequelae of facial palsy, that is crocodile tears, which is also known as crocodile tears, where there is misdirection of the postganglionic secretory fibers towards the lacrimal gland via greater superficial petrosal nerve. And this is pre-food, this is before food, and this is after food. You can see there is the Sarma strip almost has been weighted. And in this case managed by transconjunctival botulinum toxin injection to lacrimal gland, 7.5 unit has been given. And this is the result after 4 weeks. There is no such difference in the pre and after food. But the problem is the effect of botulinum toxin in these cases usually stays for only 4 to 5 months. Then again the symptoms appears and have to give it repeatedly. Here I am to share rare oculofacial synkinesis cases which appears after facial paralysis. That is Marin-Amart syndrome. This is a oculofacial synkinesis that occurs due to aberrant regeneration of the facial nerve after peripheral facial nerve palsy. Here you can see when the patient is using the mouth or opening the mouth, there is squeezing of the right eye. Their orbicularis oculi gets stimulated. This is grossly, it is just a reverse of the Marcus gun phenomenon we see in ptosis, but it is not inverse Marcus gun. The mechanism is different here. When he is using the jaw, the eye is squeezing, right eye is squeezing. So this patient has been managed by botulinum toxin injection, and this is the result after 1 month. Now when he is opening his mouth or using the muscular mastication, there is no such movement of the right eye. Again, this action actually stays for only 4 to 6 months, and you have to repeat the botulinum toxin injection repeatedly. So ophthalmologists are often the first point of contact for facial palsy cases, and along with the eye care, we are also responsible for diagnosis and proper referral for extended care if the patient needed some neurosurgical or ENT treatment. Prompt management of acute stage is important to save the vision. The main priority is to ensure adequate corneal protection. Long-term sequelae of the facial nerve palsy may be tackled later accordingly. Thank you. So next, so our next speaker is Dr. Saptagiri Sambhatla sir. Sir will be talking on surgical management of facial palsy. Over to you, sir.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Okay, just a minute. Let's go full screen. Is my screen visible now?
Yes, Dr. Saptagiri, you are.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Joyita, and it's been a wonderful session early in the morning on a Sunday. Dr. Nidhi and Dr. Joyita and Dr. Shruti, wonderful presentation, so much of learning. What I'll be presenting is just what we do. There are a lot of surgical options when it comes to facial palsy. And the most important thing before we plan the surgical options is to evaluate what is the duration of the palsy, whether it is since birth or has it come up recently, and how is the behavior of the palsy, as mentioned by Dr. Joyita in taking. what is the position of the brow? Has the brow also fallen down, or is it still stable? Because that's also going to change our management protocol. Because if the brow is far too down, even if you want to play around with the upper lid or not, whether lifting up of the brow is going to actually worsen the lag of thalamus is also a decision that has to be taken. Now, what is the position of both of the upper and the lower lids? Because if the lower lid is far down, you have to plan to first pick up the lower lid. If the upper lid is far up than the lower lid, and lower lids are much more stable, you have to want to bring the upper lid down first and then look at picking up the lower lid later. So these are decisions that you have to take subsequently. So documentation of the position of the lids is very important. What is the position? What is the status of the medial canthus? And also the condition of the cheek muscles, cheek skin muscle, like the facial muscle tone and how far they have actually pulled down, because gravity pulls everything down. So we have to know what is the effect of gravity that has taken place. So what are the surgical management options that are there? I'm dividing them into two things, either the lower lid lifting procedures or the upper lid dropping procedures. So among the lower lid lifting procedures, first is the tarsorrhaphy. Now, it is not the treatment of choice, but yes, in some certain conditions, a good lateral tarsorrhaphy or even a medial tarsorrhaphy can give good results. But of course, this does not treat the main pathology, because the pathology is happening somewhere with the canthal tendons and the lid laxity. The other is, of course, the lateral tarsal strip. The standard lateral tarsal strip has wonderful correction. In this, what we do is we anchor the lateral canthus at least 4 millimeters above its original insertion, so that the lateral contour is picked up, and that gives a little amount of cover. Then there was a technique described by Jane Olver et al., where she's described what is called as the augmented lateral tarsal strip, where the lateral tarsus in the lower lid is fashioned into the upper lid and anchored onto the lateral orbital rim. Then is the technique of the lower lid suspension to the upper lid, where the lower lid is the lateral and the medial ends of both the lower lid is attached to the upper lid. So what this does is this actually pulls down the upper lid, and also the upper lid, as it's opening the eye, it pulls up the lower lid. So this can also be done. This was described by some Dutch authors. And then there's been this article from Raman Malhotra et al., where they described the composite recession of the lower lid retractor, the septum, the lateral horn, and the inferior retractors, and the orbitomedular ligament. The other lower lid lifting procedures are the spacer grafts for the lower lid. You can either put the sclera or use Medport to pick up the lower lid. Then is in congenital facial palsy. This was a technique again described by Jane Olver et al., where they use the Souf lift with lateral tarsal strip and medial canthoplasty. This works in extensive facial palsy, especially the congenital facial palsies, where then the entire facial tone and is gone, and gravity is pulled the entire lid down. The other medial canthal procedures are the medial canthoplasty and the medial tarsal strip, which is popularized by the group from UK. And what is now also being practiced and giving good successful results is the posterior medial canthal tendon thermoplasty. And the upper lid dropping procedures can be the use of fillers and, as mentioned, giving injection botulinum toxin to the levator. Also, the upper lid mullarectomy can be tried, but this has limited success because it's much more successful in thyroid eyelid patients who are having lid retraction. The other technique is the levator recession, where the recession can be graded, and also you can use a spiral patch graft to add little weight to the upper lid as you're doing the recession. Then there's also a new technique called the graded levator hinge for the upper lid retraction. This is more useful in patients with thyroid orbitopathy upper lid retraction, but can also be tried with facial palsy. And the most definitive way in which you can pull the lid down is the upper lid loading procedures, with either you can use dermis fat, you can use donor sclera, gold and platinum implants. There are a lot of other procedures like the palpebral spring et al. And other techniques, but palpebral spring has a lot of disadvantages, so it's almost practically now given up. The loading procedures are much more simpler and easier and more predictable. So I'll just show some couple of surgeries. This is the tongue and groove tarsorrhaphy, which I usually practice for tarsorrhaphy. So it's very simple surgery, but gives very long-lasting results, and it's very stable. in the sense that vis-a-vis intermarginal tarsorrhaphy, the strength of this tarsorrhaphy is much higher. So we just give a gray line incision in the upper lid, and we make a small tongue of the upper lid. It's very similar to any other lid reconstructive procedures actually. And this was done for actually a neurotrophic corneal ulcer. You can see the corneal ulcer there. But the same can be done either in the medial end or the lateral canthal area. So that is the groove which is being fashioned in the lower lid. Once that is done, it is sutured, and the anterior lamella can also be closed over bolsters. And this can also be divided into lines as we do in routine division for any lid retraction, lid reconstructive procedures. So I'll just go to the next slide. So this is another technique, what I was mentioning about the posterior medial canthal tendon plication. So what we can do here is, we see that this patient has a lot of medial canthal dystropia, that the entire lower lid is down from the medial end, the sagging far down. See the length of the lower lid, the height of the lower lid, it's far down over here. Upper lid is fairly okay. There's little amount of brow sag, but it's fairly, it is equal. So we need to address the lower lid. The upper lid we can see later. So what we did here was we first fashioned the lateral tarsal strip. So this is standard lateral tarsal strip which is being fashioned. Once lateral tarsal strip is fashioned, I'll be putting this patch graft in the lower lid. So what is done is subconjunctivally the retractors are detached from the lower border of the tarsus, and at least about a 5 millimeter strip, 5 millimeter by about 20 millimeter of donor sclera is sutured onto the lower border of the tarsus and the upper border of the retractors, so that the length is increased. This also gives little amount of stability to the tarsal plate. Once that is done, we do what is called as the medial canthal thermoplasty, where we apply burns. I'm using Elman cautery. So this is the punctum, area of the punctum. So this area, this is where the Horner muscle lies actually. So that area is actually cauterized, and this cauterization is actually quite deep. So what happens is, the moment this entire cicatrix contracts, this pulls the posterior aspect of the lower lid inwards and upwards, as a result of which the entire lid moves upwards. And once that is done, we actually need to support the entire medial lid. So this suture is passed just lateral to the punctum, and we take a small mattress suture and is anchored into a firm tissue in the upper part of the medial canthal tendon. So there's a pull which keeps the lid in place as the cicatrix is healing, because we need to give time for the cicatrix to heal. So the needle is passed out and emerged out through firm tissue over there, and I'm putting also a small bolster, so that gives it that amount of strength to hold that entire lid down upwards, because gravity is going to pull the lid downwards anyway. So we need to support it in an upward direction. So once that is done, I'm just passing a bolster and anchoring the entire tissue there. And then subsequently, the lateral canthal, the lateral LTS is sutured up. The lateral tarsal strip wound is sutured. So this was how the patient was. See, this is the preoperative. See the length, it's far down. This is post-op 2 weeks. The lid is actually much higher than what it was earlier. And that's a fair amount of coverage for the cornea and sclera, and the lag of thymus still is there, but that we will look at doing maybe a gold weight implant subsequently. And coming to the gold weight implant, this is a patient in whom we did a gold weight implant. This is a patient of chronic facial palsy. She had a lateral tarsorrhaphy done. This is the lateral tarsorrhaphy which was done earlier. We take a lid crease incision, And as far as the gold implant is concerned, this is a pre-designed gold weight implant, not the ready-made one available through Medef. And we create, after the lid crease incision, we create a suborbicularis pocket such that the tarsal plate is exposed right almost up to the lash line. That is the gold weight. You have the 4-hole gold weight there. And a firm anchorage is given by passing a non-absorbable suture. Here in this case, I'm using a nylon suture. And that is anchored onto the tarsal plate. The superior margin can also be anchored either to the tarsal plate or to the lower part of the LPS Muller's complex. Now, there have been various studies which have shown that even anchoring onto the lower border of the Muller's muscle and the LPS complex also gives a very good result. What is important in placing the gold weight is you have to see where you're putting it. It's preferable to put it a little more medial than lateral, because the medial part is where the lagophthalmus is much more severe than the lateral part. In the lateral part, actually, the weight actually falls down. So there's a generalized much better coverage for the cornea. So once the implant is anchored, the incision is closed down in layers. That's the muscle being closed, and subsequently the skin is closed. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for giving this excellent talk on surgical management of facial palsy. So now we'll have a panel discussion. I don't think anybody has any question. Dr. Nidhi, are you here?
Yes,
hello.
Yes, Director.
Yes. Do you have any question?
Well, actually, a very nice talk, Dr. Nidhi. Yeah. Very nice pictures and very lucid way of explaining the entire facial nerve and its course. Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, sir.
And yeah, Dr. Shruti, it was wonderful. There's the controversies with the facial nerve and the 11 points. It was very nice.
Thanks, Dr. Saptagirish. I have a question. When the thermoplasty, I've done a couple of them, and in that I've always had problems. It's like, when you take the fulgurator and then you go under that, and the Horner's muscles is all like, you go deep in and then cauterize it. But whenever I take a bite from the medial side and try to hitch it to the medial canthal tendon up and above, I somehow don't get that contour. It kind of flips open, whatever I do, and then I have to couple it with the lateral tarsal strip, and then it gets fairly better. But initially when you take that bite, somehow the lid tends to flip a little out and the punctum tends to turn a little out. So is it the angulation as such which is causing the problem, or should it always be coupled up with the lateral lateral tarsal strip? But over time
yeah, nice. Yes, it will get better. Well, the initial studies which were published for the PMCT, they said that it may or may not be combined with a lateral tarsal strip. Now, generally, most of them will require lateral tarsal strip, so that actually opens up the entire lateral tarsus, and you tend to hitch it up a little higher because the patient is having a facial palsy. But the trick lies in actually having a good needle, the P2 needle, actually with a 3x8 curve, with a 5x8 curve. If it's a cutting, then fine, because then you can actually get the curvature to pass it across to the firm tissue. Now, what I've noticed, it is very difficult to have the P2 needle pass because it's very small. So one thing that I do is I use a standard the needles with an eye, and just give it a little more curvature by bending the needles, and then that is passed through the firm tissue on the medial canthus. So the idea is the more firmer tissue you get a bite through and closer to the periosteum, the firmer will be the anchorage to the medial side. Now, the classical description has been that you just pass it the way I've shown it, just to pass it across and put a bolster. But what I've learned is after doing some of them is that what I now do is I use a polyester suture and I give a small buttonhole nick on the area where I'm going to emerge out. And then once the needle passes out through the periosteum, I give a knot over there, just like how we do for lateral tarsal strip. So give a knot onto the periosteum and then close the skin with the absorbable suture the way we close the skin. So this way, what happens is the entire medial canthus is secured, and with a normal non-absorbable suture like polyester, it stays in place for a much longer time. So
And you don't remove the sutures.
No, it stays inside. Yes, that medial one stays inside. I just give an additional bolster also, which I just trim it off after about 2 weeks time. So the medial end suture stays there for much longer. But a couple of patients, what has happened is even the medial one has given way because of the weight of the cheek. So the cheek is too heavy, it just falls down. So there's one patient of mine who's actually had a cheek drop in spite of doing all this. So now I'm planning to do a mid-face lift for him and then try to anchor the entire medial lid upwards.
Anchor it to the periosteum wherever and give it that lift.
Yes. So that you have to do a swoof. Swoof lift.
Yeah, right.
Yes. Just like that. Here will be the low lid lift actually. So the entire low lid with a little amount of mid-face has to be picked up, then anchored on the periosteum, and then anchor the low lid again back again. So.
So we have seen in some of the cases after long period of after gold plate implantation, like after 5-6 years, the plate has been spontaneously extruded, but still the effect of the lead weight is still there. So how will you explain this? Like I just recently have seen one patient at SN long back, I think it's around 8 years back. The gold weight implantation has been done in SN, and now it's spontaneously extruded, and I have taken it out. But now still she doesn't need any further procedures for the lagophthalmos part. So what is your experience?
No, actually what happens is that, yes, gold weight can extrude out over time also. What happens is that because of the weight being there for such a long time, there's a lot of fibrous tissue which is laid around the gold weight itself. Even though gold weight is an inert material, gold or platinum, whatever it is, there's a lot of fibrous tissue which is laid around the implant. So that amount of fibrous tissue gives a little amount of weight onto the sclera is what I suppose. And this little sclera also maybe thickens a little bit. Unless the implant is extruded from the scleral aspect, which is a different story altogether. But when it's coming out from the skin, there is little amount of thickening also of the tarsal plate. So that also gives some weight to the lid itself. There are some surgeons who actually just put some amount of scleral, just take a donor sclera and wrap it, put 2-3 layers of it like a sandwich, and they put it onto the tarsal plate. And that amount of weight is also good enough to close the lid to some extent. But it's more that I think some amount of fibrous reaction does take place. That's why even after the gold weight comes down, the lagophthalmos is not as it was before putting the gold weight.
And can go in the patient where they cannot afford gold or platinum weight, in those cases, can the levator recession and molar recession with some scleral spacer graft can replace the same result, like the same as gold? Or can we expect?
No, actually, what happens is, unlike thyroid eye disease, where it's because of very severe, strongly acting molars and other factors, the lid retraction here is not because of any pathology because of that. It's because of non-acting of the orbicularis. So even if you do a levator recession, the patient should be careful because the patient should not develop ptosis. Because if you do excessive levator recession, the patient can end up with ptosis, and then the main purpose of doing the surgery is all defeated. So you can do what is called the graded levator recession, although it has been described for thyroid eye disease. That can be tried. I have no experience in that, but when going through literature, I was just searching, maybe we could do that. The other option is, of course, to do a graded levator recession by putting a sterile patch cup so that in case you want to revise it back again, you know where the levator is and you can again play around with it, bring it back to its original place. That is another option. Yes, you can try that. But you have to be careful because here you should not induce ptosis. Otherwise, the patient will be much more uncomfortable.
I have tried mullerectomy in these patients, and to a certain extent it helps. It brings down the lid by 2 millimeters and induces a small ptosis. But I think the whole idea is to bring the upper lid down and the lower lid up to reduce the interpalpebral fissure size. And so the Bell's, if the Bell's is reasonably good, and you can try that. I've tried that in the posterior approach, and it does help to a certain extent. But no single procedure as such will help in these patients with Bell's palsy. We'll have to combine them with a couple of procedures.
Yes, definitely. But I think that technique where they actually suspended the entire lower lid to the upper lid, that sounds more like the pillaring, like you're suspending, like putting a swing, like anchoring a swing.
Yes,
so
but
that sounds little
you
interesting.
Put the upper lid, lower lid up in a sense. You can also put a spacer. The whole idea is to bring the margin up.
So that way, even the Medport implants which they've tried, they're much more rigid. Yes, the Medport implants which they put for the lower lid are much more rigid. So they give a much more rigid support to the entire lower lid. But of course, you have to do a lateral tarsal strip. Otherwise, the lid will just flip out because of the weight of the implant itself.
And also in auricular cartilage also give a lot of rigidity. In one case, I have done auricular cartilage implant in the lower lid, and that is really excellent. Over the last 2 years,
you can use auricular cartilage.
Yeah. Any opinion about blepharotomy? So we just cut all the layers.
Yes, blepharotomy also can be done, but the thing is, you have better result for thyroid upper lid retraction rather than upper lid retraction because of facial palsy. The pathology is different. The way the surgery works, the reason for the lid retraction is different, and pathogenesis is different. It can be done. I mean, bring down the lid to some extent. Only thing is, blepharotomy should not induce a ptosis. That is the problem, because ptosis management post blepharotomy can be a big headache actually.
Actually, these are very resistant cases of facial palsy, especially the lower lid. Whatever procedure we do, the lid tends to sag back over time.
That will happen because gravity is going to pull down everything.
Yeah. What according to you?
Because gravity is going to pull the face down.
So what according to you has been the most foolproof method till date in your experience?
Well, nothing. There's been nothing like a foolproof technique for the lower lids.
Comparatively,
but yes, we're trying. See, the lateral tarsal strip is very nice for holding up the lateral canthus. And as far as the medial part is concerned, I found good results with the medial tarsal strip. But the problem with medial tarsal strip is that the entire lacrimal system is going to be destroyed. That is, you will not have any more canalicular system at all because you're going to cut through it and then anchor the entire lid medially. But yes, it gives a very good strong anchorage to the medial part. It's almost like doing a lateral tarsal strip from the medial side. So it gives very good anchorage. It's very strong.
So
but yes, patient will have tearing for a long time.
You put the scleral spacer
yes,
in all your
scleral spacer graft.
In all your patients while you're doing the medial?
Not all patients. Not all patients. Those who require it. Like this patient which I showed you, there's a lot of fall actually, and the entire medial canthal anatomy was almost like obscured only. So that's the reason why if you're picking up the medial canthus and especially the thermoplasty, you have to give something to hold the entire lid. Otherwise, it's just going to fall down again.
So what are your
so you have to give it posterior support for the element.
Yeah, what that was a fulguration.
See, you have to actually, yes, it's a fulguration. But the thing is, I use a fulguration ball with the cutting thing, the fulguration board that is. Okay. So the idea is that you have to have a firm burn on the area where the Horner's muscle is there. Firm burn is defined as whitening or blanching of the entire tissue. So what happens when you blanch it is that, and then you wipe it and wipe off the debris, you'll see the entire thing becomes white, almost very pale it is. So that heals by scarring, and the idea is that as the scar contracts, it's going to pull the entire lid upwards and hold it in place or medially.
So
But if the weight of the cheek is very much, it just pull it down.
Yeah. Is the video available somewhere online? If you want to see that again.
Sorry?
Is your video available somewhere online? If you want to see it
Sir,
I'll be putting it online onto the Shankara YouTube channel.
Okay.
Maybe you can subscribe and then you can watch it.
Thank you, sir.
Another
Thank you.
problem
Thank you,
that
Joy.
I had is, are we done? Do we have time?
yes, ma'am. We have 10 minutes.
Okay. Another thing with medial tarsal strip that I have had is like if you're cutting the compromising on the canaliculus,
He is not ready.
all that, anchoring itself is a little bit challenge because the bone is so thin there, and when you take a bite there, it invariably cuts through, and then to get that hold is very difficult. Do you have any tips for that, Dr. Saptagirish?
Yes, actually, the main thing is again the needle. It boils down to the needle that you're handling. It's very difficult. We don't have the P2 needle with a non-absorbable suture. Unfortunately, we have the P2 needle that is a 5x8 curved needle on a Vicryl. So Vicryl will get absorbed, and you don't want to use Vicryl as a tarsal strip procedure because you need to anchor it for a long time. So what I am doing is I'm taking these the normal needles with an eye and just bending them across so that that curvature is attained, and then thread the polyester suture and then pass it across. Sometimes if you may actually go through the bone also when you're passing it. The bone is so thin there, so you should be careful that the periosteum is not disturbed. So you pass through the periosteum. If you go through the bone, fine. Then again come out to the periosteum, so it will heal. It's like actually a small puncture. The bone will heal by itself. And it's quite a good strong anchor. The only thing is, yes, it is a little difficult, no doubt about it. Anything around the medial canthus is difficult because you have to go posterior and you have to go superior. Extreme challenge it is.
I think Dr. Saptagirish,
so it is difficult, no doubt about it.
Chat box. How can we procure gold weight?
Gold weight, yeah.
Yeah.
Gold weight. No, there are two ways. One is you have the MedDev gold weight now available. I think Akriti is now selling it. You can either buy it from them or you can design it yourself. So what we have used is we are designing our own gold weight implants, and the only thing is you have to have a good jeweler who will give you a guarantee on the gold that he is using. He should be able to give pure 24 karat gold of 999 purity. So if he's able to give that, and you can design your own gold weight implant, and I think that should be good. But if you want to buy a ready-made one, I think Akriti is selling the MedDev implants. They're a little more expensive than the one that you design yourself. Because most of the goldsmiths, when you tell them that you've come from Shankara and you're giving it for patients, they tend to give a lot of discount, and they even reduce their making charges. So we just try to hackle with them and tell them that you're using it for patients, and they'll be grateful to you for life. So most of them are actually quite nice. They don't charge for their making. But that's how it is. I mean, MedDev is little expensive. That's what I found out. So that's why I'm using a jeweler from Kolkata, and he does a good job with it. I think there are no more questions.
Yes. So we are almost finishing on
she's
time.
asking how much it roughly costs. The cost of the gold weight will depend upon the weight, the cost of the gold at the time of procuring or ordering. Generally, what they do is they ask us to make at least about 10 grams. So if you're ordering for 10 pieces, so each one is about 1 gram. So you pay for 10 gram gold at whatever the rate is. So right now it's about 50,000 to 45 to 50,000. So that is the cost of gold, and making charges about maybe 10, 15,000. So you get about for 60, 70,000, you get about 10 pieces. That's how it is.
It is approximately 8,000 and 816 like that. Recently I got so.
That's what we also got recently from there, and got the cost of the same cost.
Okay. Such a nice session. Thank you all my speakers. Dr. Nidhi, it's such a insightful talk on, it's interesting, and it's a very crisp and comprehensive talk on anatomy of facial palsy. And Dr. Shruti Madam, it's a really nice presentation, and we have to read all these things again to get all the points. And Dr. Saptagiri sir, your presentation is always good, and actually you have actually give the interest on facial nerve. I am really addicted to this topic. For many years, I am trying to present this something in this topic, and it's possible today now. Thank you so much for this excellent presentation. And I again like to thank the AIOC organizing committee for choosing this IC for this.
Thank you so much, Joy. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Thanks, Nidhi.
Thank you. Thank you.